The silence in the small cabin was a living thing, thick and heavy like wool soaked in water. It pressed in on Maribel from the rough-hewn log walls, seeped up from the packed earth floor, and dripped from the low, soot-stained ceiling. For 10 years, this silence had been her only companion during the long hours she waited. It was a treacherous friend, for it always gave way to the sound of his horse, the stomp of his boots on the porch, and the final, dreadful turning of the iron door latch. Montana, 1877. The land was vast and unforgiving, a place of stark beauty and hidden dangers. But for Mara, the world had shrunk to the size of this 2-room cabin and the small, fenced-in yard where a few chickens scratched at the barren dirt. Her husband, Reverend Silas Bell, had brought her here to be his helpmeet, to live a life of pious servitude under the watchful eye of God and his own heavy hand. He preached fire and damnation from a makeshift pulpit in the nearby town on Sundays, his voice a rolling thunder that promised eternal suffering for sinners. During the week, he practiced his sermons on her, using his leather belt to beat the devil out of a wife who was too slow with his dinner, too quiet in her responses, or simply too present in his line of sight. Tonight, the silence was different. It was stretched thin, humming with a tension that made the hairs on Mara's arms stand on end. He was late. The stew on the hearth had grown a skin, and the cornbread beside it was cold and hard as a river stone. The air was unnaturally still, the way it gets before a summer storm breaks over the plains. Mara sat at the small table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She had learned long ago that showing fear was an invitation. She had to become like stone, like the mountains that loomed in the distance, enduring and impassive. Her body was a roadmap of his righteousness. A faint, yellowing bruise bloomed on her cheekbone, hidden mostly by her dark, severe bun of hair. Her arms, covered by the long sleeves of her drab calico dress, were a tapestry of old and new pains. She moved with a certain stiffness, a caution that had become second nature, as if her own bones might betray her and make a sound that would displease him. Then came the sound, not the familiar plod of his old gelding, but a frantic, stumbling gallop. The horse whinnied, a high, panicked sound. The heavy thud of his boots hit the porch, followed by a curse that was anything but holy. The door flew open with a bang that made Mara jolt, her carefully constructed stillness shattering like glass. Silas filled the doorway, a great, hulking shadow against the dying light. His black coat was askew, stained with something dark down the front. His face, usually florid and stern, was pale and contorted with a rage that went beyond his usual whiskey-fueled temper. In his hand, he held not his Bible, but a horsewhip. "Woman," he snarled, and the word was a lash in itself. "You sit there, while my name is dragged through the mud, while that whelp from the saloon accuses me of cheating at cards." Mara said nothing. Her throat had closed up, a fist of ice lodging itself in her windpipe. She knew this look. It was the one that came before he lost all control when the man of God was completely consumed by the beast within. "He called me a liar, me, a servant of the Lord." Silas stepped inside, letting the door slam shut. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air sucked out of it by his presence. The smell of cheap whiskey and sweat rolled off him in waves, fouling the small space. "He will answer to God for his slander, but you will help me pray for his soul." His version of prayer was a ritual of pain. He saw sin everywhere, and it was his God-given duty to cleanse it. He saw it in the dust on the mantelpiece, in the slight crack in a ceramic plate, and most of all, in her. He strode toward her, the whip coiling and uncoiling like a serpent in his grip. "On your knees," he commanded. Mara's body, trained by years of obedience, began to move. But her mind, for the first time, rebelled. A decade of swallowed screams, of silent tears, of praying to a God who never answered, finally boiled over. It was not a conscious decision, not a heroic stand. It was the desperate, final instinct of a cornered animal. As she lowered herself, her hand brushed against the cold, heavy iron of the fireplace poker resting on the hearth. Her fingers closed around it. The metal was solid, real, a stark contrast to her life, which felt thin and fragile, like a spider's web about to be torn apart. He was upon her, his hand grabbing a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back. "You will learn respect, Mara. You will learn the fear of God." The pain was sharp, blinding, but through it, something else surged. A cold, clear calm. As he raised the whip, she swung the poker. She put all the weight of her small frame, all the force of 10 years of misery, into the motion. It was not a graceful or practiced blow. It was clumsy, desperate. The poker connected with the side of his head with a sickening, wet thud. Silas grunted, a sound of pure shock. His grip on her hair loosened. His eyes, wide with disbelief, met hers for a fleeting second. There was no anger in them now, only a vast, empty surprise. Then he swayed, a great tree losing its roots, and crashed to the floor. The whip fell from his hand, landing softly on the rag rug. Silence rushed back into the cabin, but this was a new kind of silence. It was vast, deafening, absolute. Mara scrambled back, crab-walking away from his prone form until her back hit the opposite wall. She stared, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He didn't move. A dark pool began to spread from beneath his head, staining the wooden planks a deep, glistening black in the flickering firelight. "Silas," she whispered. The name felt alien in her mouth. There was no answer. The only sound was the frantic, terrified hammering of her own heart. She had done it. After all the beatings, all the prayers for deliverance, she had delivered herself. She had killed her husband. The thought didn't bring relief. It didn't bring freedom. It brought a paralyzing, soul-crushing terror that was colder and deeper than any fear she had ever known before. She was a killer, a sinner beyond redemption. The hell he had always promised her was now a certainty. During the struggle, the kerosene lamp on the table had been knocked over. It had rolled, spilling its contents onto the dry floorboards. Now, a small flame from the hearth, a single errant spark, leaped from the stone to the oil-soaked wood. A tiny line of fire hissed to life. Mara watched it, mesmerized. She watched as it licked at the leg of the table, as it grew from a snake to a wave, climbing the wall with a hungry roar. The heat washed over her face, snapping her out of her trance. The cabin, her prison for a decade, was now becoming her tomb. Panic, raw and primal, finally broke through the numbness. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be found here, with his body and the evidence of her sin. She stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Her eyes darted around the room that contained the entirety of her married life. There was nothing she wanted, not the worn-out dress in the chest, not the chipped china, not the faded tintype of her parents on the mantel. It was all tainted, all part of the life that was now burning to the ground. Smoke began to fill the room, thick and acrid. It stung her eyes and clawed at her throat. The roar of the fire was growing louder, consuming the silence, consuming everything. She turned and fled. She didn't grab a coat or shoes or a handful of the bread she had baked that morning. She ran out of the door in her thin cotton dress, her feet bare. The cool night air was a shock after the intense heat of the cabin, but she barely felt it. She did not look back. She couldn't bear to see the flames that were erasing her past. She could only run. Her bare feet hit the hard-packed dirt of the yard, then the sharp, loose gravel of the path beyond. Stones cut into her soles, but the pain was a distant, unimportant thing. Her body was a machine, driven by a single imperative escape. The moon was high and full, a cold, silver disk in an ink-black sky. It lit the landscape in shades of gray and shadow, turning familiar shapes into monstrous specters. The sagebrush clawed at the hem of her dress. their dry branches scratching her ankles. The wind picked up, a low, mournful sigh that swept across the plains, carrying the scent of smoke and her own terror with it. She ran without direction, without a destination. There was nowhere to go. The nearest town was a day's ride, and they would know her. They would know Silas. They would see the murderess in her eyes. There was only a way. Away from the fire, away from the body, away from the life she had just ended. Her lungs burned, each breath a searing agony. A stitch of pain flared in her side. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced them to keep moving. Stumble, rise, run. The rhythm became a prayer, a desperate litany against the encroaching darkness, both outside and within. The glow of the fire behind her eventually faded, swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. Now, there was only the moonlight on her shoulders, a cold and heavy weight. There was the wind in her ears, whispering accusations, and there was the rhythmic, desperate slap of her own bare feet on the unforgiving earth. She did not know how long she ran. Time had dissolved, along with everything else. The world had been reduced to sensation, the burning in her muscles, the cold on her skin, the sharp pain in her feet, the taste of ash in her mouth. Her mind was a wasteland. The image of Silas falling, of the blood spreading on the floor, was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. But beneath that image was a profound, terrifying emptiness. She had been a wife, a servant of God, a victim. Now, she was nothing. She was a ghost fleeing a pyre, a nameless creature running under a silent moon. She was alive, but the part of her that could feel, the part that could hope or dream or even despair, had died back in the cabin. What was left was just this, a shell of a woman, hollowed out and scoured clean by violence and fear, running into the endless, empty dark. The world had dissolved into a nightmare of running. Thorns and sharp stones tore at Mara's feet, turning them into a bloody, unfeeling pulp. The muscles in her legs screamed, then went numb, moving on a memory of motion that her mind no longer controlled. She ran until the moon began its slow descent, until the flat, open plains began to heave and swell, rising into foothills covered in the dark. Jagged shapes of pine trees. The air grew thinner, colder, smelling of resin and damp earth. She stumbled into the forest, a realm of deep shadows and hushed sounds. The trees rose around her like silent sentinels, their high branches blocking out the moonlight and leaving her in a disorienting, near-total darkness. She fell, her hands sinking into a bed of damp pine needles, the sharp, clean scent filling her senses. For a moment, she lay there, her body refusing to obey any further commands. Her breath came in ragged, painful sobs, but the image of the fire, the image of Silas's still form, pushed her onward. She couldn't stop. To stop was to be found. To be found was to be judged. She pushed herself up and staggered forward, using the rough bark of the trees to guide her. She was climbing now, the ground sloping steeply upward. Each step was an agony. Her flight was no longer a run, but a desperate, pathetic crawl through the undergrowth. A wild animal, wounded and seeking a place to die. It was in this state, when the last flicker of coherent thought was guttering out, that she saw it. A light. It was small and faint, a warm, yellow-orange glow filtering through the dense trees. It was a candle, or a lantern, impossibly far from any road or town. It was a sign of human life. For a sane person, it would have been a beacon of hope. For Mara, it was a new spike of terror. People meant questions. People meant law. People meant a rope. Her first instinct was to turn, to flee back into the concealing darkness. But her body had reached its absolute limit. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees. She could go no further. The light was there, and she was here, and the space between them was the end of her world. She could only watch it, a moth drawn to a flame that promised not warmth, but utter annihilation. The light came from a small cabin, nestled in a clearing so natural it seemed to have grown there with the trees. It was a simple, sturdy structure of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney from which a thin curl of smoke rose, almost invisible against the night sky. A man sat on the porch. Joshua Rains did not belong to the world anymore. He had given it up, piece by piece, until all that was left was this cabin, this patch of unforgiving mountain, and the vast, quiet company of the pines. He had come here to let the silence scour him clean, to let the wind and the snow wear away the man he had been. That man had a name that was sometimes whispered in dusty saloons and around lonely campfires, a name tied to smoke and silver dollars and the cold, flat finality of a gunshot. Joshua Rains was the name of the man who was trying to forget. He was sitting on a three-legged stool, a piece of pine in one hand and a knife in the other, carving a small, intricate bird. His hands, which were calloused and scarred, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. They were hands that knew how to be both destructive and gentle. The yellow light from the lantern on the railing beside him carved deep shadows into the lines on his face. He was not old, perhaps 35, but he was weathered like the logs of his cabin, worn down by sun and sorrow. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing. Instantly, the carving stopped. The knife froze. Joshua's head lifted, his body going unnaturally still. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the line of trees. It was the stillness of a predator, an absolute, coiled tension that was at odds with the peaceful setting. His right hand rested on his thigh, his fingers unconsciously flexing, reaching for the ghost of a pistol that no longer hung at his hip. He had trained himself out of the habit of carrying a gun, but he had never managed to train the instinct out of his nerves. He saw a flicker of movement, a pale shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows. It wasn't a deer or a cougar. It was human. He slowly rose to his feet, placing the carving and the knife on the stool. He didn't call out. He just waited, a silent, unmovable figure on the porch. The shape stumbled out of the trees and into the faint spill of the lantern light. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her dress was ripped and stained with dirt. Her dark hair had come undone, falling in a wild tangle around a face that was a pale, haunted mask of exhaustion and terror. Her feet were bare, and he could see from the porch that they were cut and bleeding. She took another lurching step into the clearing and then stopped, swaying, her eyes fixed on him. They were wide and dark, and seemed to suck all the light and warmth from the small clearing. Joshua had seen his share of desperation. He had seen the fear in men's eyes before they died. He had seen the grief of women who had lost everything. But this was different. This was a soul that had been hollowed out, leaving only a raw, animal terror behind. She made a small, choking sound, and her knees began to give way. He moved then, stepping off the porch in 2 long, quiet strides. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, a slow, mournful sound that seemed to measure the gravity of the moment. He moved with a purpose that was neither threatening nor comforting. It was simply efficient. He had to stop her from falling face first onto the rocky ground. He reached her just as her eyes rolled back in her head. He put a hand out, his fingers wrapping gently around her upper arm to steady her. His touch was firm, his hand warm and solid against her cold skin. It was just a touch, a simple, human gesture of support. But for Mara, it was a cataclysm. For 10 years, every touch from a man had been a prelude to pain. A hand on her arm was a grip, a precursor to being thrown, or shaken, or held down. Her shattered mind, lost between the horrors of the past and the terror of the present, could not process the simple kindness of the act. It only registered the contact, the pressure, the male strength. A tremor ran through her body. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, looking through him rather than at him. A whisper, so faint it was barely more than a breath of air, escaped her cracked lips. "Don't stop." The words hung in the silent air between them. They were ragged, desperate, broken. Joshua froze. His fingers, which had been a source of stability, now felt like a brand. The words made no sense. Don't stop what hurting her. He wasn't hurting her. He was helping her. His mind scrambled for a reason, a logic to her plea. Was she delirious with fever? Had the flight through the woods broken her mind? He pulled his hand back as if her skin had suddenly become white-hot iron. The moment he let go, he saw it. A flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't relief. It was a deeper, more profound wave of despair, as if the last thin thread connecting her to the world had just been cut. He realized, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that he had misunderstood completely. She wasn't pleading with him to stop hurting her. She was pleading with him not to let go. That small, desperate whisper echoed in a place deep inside him he had long since boarded up. It was the voice of a ghost, the voice of a woman he had failed a lifetime ago, in another town, under another name, a voice that had pleaded for help he had been too slow or too selfish to give. Her face, her name, were blurred by years of whiskey and willed forgetting, but the sound of her fear was as clear as if it were yesterday. His breath caught in his chest. He looked at this strange, broken woman who had collapsed at the edge of his world, and he saw a reflection of his own damnation. He had run to these mountains to escape the ghosts of his past, and now one had stumbled out of the woods and spoken to him in a voice he could not ignore. Mara's strength gave out entirely. She crumpled to the ground, landing in a heap at his feet. She didn't faint. Her eyes remained open, staring blankly at the dark trunks of the pine trees. She had simply been emptied of all will. For a long moment, Joshua stood over her, a war raging within him. The man he used to be would have turned, walked back to the cabin, barred the door, and let the wilderness claim her. It was not his trouble. The world was full of trouble, and his first, last, and only rule had always been to look after himself. But the man who carved birds and listened to the soughing of the wind in the pines could not. That man was trying, with every fiber of his being, to be better than the man he had been. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he bent down. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of rags and bones. He lifted her easily. She made no sound, no protest. She was limp, passive, a doll broken by a cruel child. He carried her across the clearing and up the steps into the cabin. The inside was as sparse and simple as the outside. A single cot was built into one wall, covered with a thick wool blanket. A stone fireplace, holding the embers of a low fire, took up most of another wall. A small table, 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding tins and supplies completed the furnishings. A banjo with a worn, polished neck hung from a peg on the wall, its strings glinting in the lantern light. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and solitude. He laid her down gently on the rag rug in front of the hearth, the warmest spot in the room. Her head lolled to one side, her tangled hair spilling across the floor. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. He moved with a quiet economy, his motions practiced and sure. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding a few small logs until a proper fire was crackling, pushing back the chill of the mountain night. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on a hook over the flames. He found a clean cloth and a basin. He knelt beside her. "I have to see to your feet," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. She gave no sign that she had heard him. He gently took one of her feet in his large hand. It was a ruin. The sole was a mass of cuts, bruises, and embedded thorns. He worked carefully, his rough fingers surprisingly deft as he used the warm water and cloth to clean away the dirt and blood. He pulled out the splinters one by one with a pair of tweezers from his supply shelf. Through it all, she did not flinch, did not make a sound. She simply stared into the fire, her expression utterly vacant. When he was done, he wrapped both of her feet in clean bandages made from a torn-up shirt. He stood and went to the cot, pulling the thick wool blanket from it. He returned and draped it over her, tucking it carefully around her shoulders. He backed away then, retreating to the far side of the small room. He gave her the fire, the warmth, the space. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, and just watched her. He didn't know who she was, or what terrible thing she was fleeing from. He only knew that for tonight, her flight had ended here, in his sanctuary, and that by touching her, by hearing her whispered plea, he had become tangled in her fate, just as he was tangled in his own. The silence of the mountains, which had been his comfort, was now filled with her presence, and with the deafening echo of a ghost. Mara woke to the sensation of warmth on one side of her face and a deep, penetrating cold on the other. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The familiar, oppressive weight of dread was there, a coiled serpent in her stomach. But the surroundings were wrong. The air didn't smell of stale whiskey and her husband's cold fury. It smelled of pine smoke and damp earth. Her eyes snapped open. She was on a floor, not in her bed. A fire, reduced to a bed of glowing orange coals, pulsed gently a few feet away, casting a soft, ruddy light on rough-hewn log walls. A heavy wool blanket was draped over her. She was in a strange place. She was alone, but not alone. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her whole body screaming in protest. The movement was a symphony of pain, from her savaged feet to the deep, aching exhaustion in her bones. Her eyes darted into the shadows of the small cabin, searching for the threat she knew must be there. And then she saw him. He was not near her. He sat on a stool by the cabin's single, unadorned door, as far from her as the small space would allow. In the dim, pre-dawn light, he was a silhouette, broad-shouldered and still. He was doing something with his hands, the faint, rhythmic rasp of a knife against wood the only sound in the room besides the soft breathing of the fire. He was not looking at her. His attention was entirely on the task before him, his posture one of patient concentration, not menace. Her memory came rushing back in a chaotic flood. The fight, the iron poker, the blood, the fire, the endless desperate flight through the darkness. And this man, this stranger, who had appeared out of the night and carried her here. Her first instinct, honed by a decade of abuse, was suspicion. Kindness was a currency Silas had used to purchase compliance before a beating. A gentle word was a lure into a trap. This man had tended to her feet, given her a blanket, and brought her into his home. The debt for such kindness, in her experience, would be collected with interest. She watched him, every nerve ending tingling, waiting for the demand, for the shift in his posture that would signal the beginning of the violence. But it didn't come. He simply continued his work, the steady, rhythmic scraping of his knife a strangely calming sound. It was a sound of purpose, of creation, not destruction. The minutes stretched on, marked only by the slow brightening of the gray light outside the cabin's one small window. The silence in the room was profound, yet it was a different vintage from the silence she had known. Her old life had been filled with a heavy, watchful silence, a suffocating vacuum that was always waiting to be filled by the thunder of Silas's rage. This silence was lighter. It was porous, filled with the whisper of the wind in the high pines outside and the gentle hiss of the dying embers. It was a silence that held no expectation. It simply was. Joshua felt her eyes on him. He had been aware of her stirring for some time, had heard the subtle shift in her breathing as she woke. He kept his focus on the small block of wood in his hands, giving her time. He knew what a cornered animal looked like. Any sudden movement, any direct stare, could send her spiraling back into the terror he had seen in her eyes last night. He finished a delicate curve on the bird's wing, then set the carving and the knife down beside him with a slow, deliberate motion. He rose without a word and went to the fireplace. He scooped water from a bucket into a tin pot and hung it over the coals. He moved with an unhurried, almost weary grace. He was a large man, but he seemed to take up less space than his size suggested, his movements contained and economical. He did not look at her. Mara tracked his every move, her body tensed. He was a stranger, and a stranger was a threat until proven otherwise. And in Mara's world, no one had ever been proven otherwise. She noted the details of the cabin, her mind grasping for clues, for anything that would tell her what kind of man he was. The room was sparse, almost monastic. There was no clutter, no dirt. Everything had its place. A few tins of beans and flour on a shelf, a stack of worn books in a corner, a single, chipped ceramic bowl on the table. The banjo hanging on the wall seemed the only concession to anything beyond pure survival. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less, a man who was hiding from the world. The water in the pot began to simmer, the soft bubbling a gentle counterpoint to the silence. Joshua took a tin cup from a shelf dented, the enamel worn away in places, and poured the hot water into it. He walked not to her, but to a spot on the floor about midway between them. He set the cup down carefully. Then he went to a small food safe, took out a piece of cornbread, and placed it on a tin plate next to the cup. He looked at her then, for the first time since she had woken. His gaze was not piercing or demanding. His gray eyes were clear and calm, holding a deep, abiding weariness, but no malice. "It's all I have," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. Then he turned, picked up his stool and knife, and went outside, closing the door softly behind him. Mara stared at the offering, a cup of warm water and a piece of stale bread. It was the simplest of offerings, given without condition, without even the demand of a thank you. She remained motionless for a long time, the serpent of suspicion coiling tighter in her gut. This was a test. It had to be. If she took it, she was accepting his charity, making herself beholden to him. If she refused it, she might anger him. But a gnawing hunger, sharp and undeniable, was making her dizzy. The warmth from the cup sent a tendril of steam into the cool air, and the simple, earthy smell of the cornbread was agonizing. She hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager lunch. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, was crying out for sustenance. Slowly, painfully, she crawled across the floor. The movement sent daggers of pain through her bandaged feet. She reached the cup, her hand trembling. She brought it to her lips, the hot metal a shock against her skin. The warm water slid down her raw throat. A small, blessed miracle. It was the first thing she had willingly put into her body that had not been prepared under the shadow of Silas's judgment. She picked up the cornbread. It was dry and coarse, but as she chewed it, her eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a strange, overwhelming relief. It was just bread. It was just water, but it was given freely. She ate slowly, making it last. As she finished the last crumb, she looked at the chipped bowl on the table. A thin, dark line, a crack, ran from its rim almost to its base. Someone had tried to mend it once, but the line of the break was still visible. She felt a strange kinship with the broken piece of pottery, mended, but forever scarred. Outside, she could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. The sound was steady, predictable. It was the sound of a day's work, of life continuing in its simplest form. For hours, she did not move from her spot by the fire. She simply sat and listened. She listened to the fire, to the wind, to the steady chop of the axe. She existed within those sounds, letting them wash over her, a balm on her frayed nerves. The man, Joshua, did not come back inside until the sun was high in the sky. When he did, he carried an armful of split logs. He moved to the fireplace, stacked them neatly in a wood box, and then turned to the pot of water without a glance in her direction. He made coffee, the rich, bitter aroma filling the small cabin. He poured himself a cup, and then, after a moment's hesitation, poured a second, which he left on the floor in the same spot as before. He took his cup and his carving and went back outside. This became the rhythm of the day, a silent, unspoken dance of existence. He lived his life around her, never intruding, never demanding. He provided for her basic needs, warmth, water, a little food with the same quiet detachment he might show to a stray animal that had wandered into his clearing. And for Mara, this detachment was the greatest kindness he could have possibly shown her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she came from, or what horrors had driven her barefoot into his forest. He did not offer words of comfort, which she would not have believed, nor pity, which she would have despised. He offered her only one thing: a safe, silent space in which to exist. As evening began to fall, painting the sky in strokes of purple and orange, a deep, profound exhaustion settled over her, heavier than the wool blanket. Her body, finally feeling some measure of safety, was beginning to shut down. Her eyelids felt like lead weights. Joshua came inside and lit the lantern as the last of the light faded. He added logs to the fire, building it up against the night's chill. He ate his own meal of beans from a tin, sitting at the small table, his back to her. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the small, domestic sounds of a shared, if separate, existence. When he was done, he scraped the plate clean and stood. He looked over at her, still huddled in the blanket by the hearth. Her eyes were closed, her breathing deep and even. She was finally asleep. He moved to his cot, but then stopped. It was his only bed. He looked at her, then back at the cot. With a quiet sigh, he took the thin mattress from its frame and laid it on the floor for himself. On the far side of the cabin, he would sleep on the floor. Mara, lost in the first dreamless sleep she had known in a decade, did not see the gesture. She did not know that her protector had given up his bed for her. She only knew, on some deep, instinctual level, that she was warm. She was not hungry, and the door was not locked. For the first time in her adult life, she slept without one ear listening for the sound of angry footsteps, without her body tensed for a blow that might come at any moment from the darkness. She slept, while outside the wind whispered secrets to the ancient pines, and a quiet man sat watch, haunted by ghosts of his own. The threads of her tattered soul, frayed and torn, were not yet mended, but here, in the stillness of this stranger's cabin, the first tentative stitches were being made. 3 days passed in a slow, silent rhythm. The sun would rise, casting long, exploratory fingers of light through the pines. Joshua would already be outside, the sound of his axe or the soft nicker of a horse the only sign of his presence. Mara would wake to the coals of a banked fire and the offering of water and food left on the floor. She would eat, her eyes tracking the slow crawl of sunlight across the rough floorboards. She moved from the hearth to the doorway, but never crossed the threshold. The world outside the cabin was a place of ghosts and judgment. The world inside was a quiet, Spartan sanctuary. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a language. It spoke of respect for boundaries, of a shared understanding that words were inadequate for the things they carried. Her body began to heal. The cuts on her feet scabbed over, and the deep, throbbing ache in her muscles lessened. She moved with less pain, though the stiffness in her soul remained. She watched him work. She saw the way he gentled a wild mare that had wandered into the clearing, his voice a low, soothing murmur, his hands firm but kind. He moved with the horse, a silent negotiation of trust, and Mara felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It was a longing for that kind of peace, that kind of unspoken understanding. He never asked her anything. He accepted her presence as he accepted the changing of the seasons, a natural, unremarked-upon event. This quiet acceptance was more unsettling to Mara than any interrogation could have been. It chipped away at the wall of mistrust she had spent a decade building. It was a kindness so profound and so unconditional that her broken spirit did not know how to receive it. The breaking point came on the fourth night. The wind howled in the eaves, a low, keening moan that sounded like a woman weeping. Mara, wrapped in her blanket by the fire, had finally drifted into a deep sleep. But sleep offered no escape. It dragged her back to the cabin, back to the smell of whiskey and the weight of Silas's hand in her hair. She was trapped in the suffocating darkness of her old life. The familiar terror, a physical weight on her chest. In her dream, the poker was too heavy to lift. His face, twisted in righteous fury, loomed over her. She woke with a strangled cry, bolting upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands flew up to protect her face. The cabin was dark, save for the flickering, demonic dance of the firelight. For a terrifying second, the shadows on the wall took the shape of her husband. "Easy," a low voice said from the darkness across the room. The sound of his voice, calm and steady, cut through the fog of her nightmare. She lowered her hands, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She could just make out his shape, sitting on the thin mattress on the floor, a dark, unmoving silhouette. He had not moved toward her. He had not lit the lantern. He remained at a distance, a silent guardian in the dark. A bad dream, he stated. It was not a question. Mara couldn't speak. She could only nod, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to stop the violent trembling that had taken over her body. The nightmare had ripped open the wounds she had been trying to ignore, and the pain of her past was bleeding into the quiet safety of the present. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. She felt his eyes on her, not with curiosity, but with a deep, unwavering attention. It was the gaze of a man who was no stranger to the dark things that haunt the night. "My husband," she began, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She didn't know why she was speaking. The words were just coming. A dam of silence had broken inside her, and a decade of unshed tears and unspoken horrors was pouring out. He was a minister, a man of God. Joshua said nothing. He did not move. He simply listened, his silence an invitation, a vast, empty space that she could fill with her truth. He was well regarded, she continued, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. In town, they saw a pillar of the community, a righteous man. He spoke of love and forgiveness from the pulpit, but at home, she trailed off, the memory too sharp. At home, he spoke of discipline, the discipline of the Lord. He believed a wife's soul was a wild garden that must be tended with a firm hand, lest it be overgrown with the weeds of sin. She looked down at her own hands, pale and trembling in the firelight. Pride was a weed. A question was a weed. A burnt loaf of bread. That was a weed that required a harsh pruning. She finally looked across the room at him, her eyes pleading for, she didn't know what. Not for belief, not for pity, just for him to hear. His Bible was always open on the table. He would read scripture while he tended to my soul. He called it purification. He said the pain was a holy fire, burning away my wickedness. Her story came out in fragments, a mosaic of small cruelties and profound terrors. She spoke of the isolation, of how his reputation had been her cage. Who would believe the word of a simple, a quiet woman against that of a beloved minister? She spoke of the chilling calm with which he administered his punishments, his eyes devoid of anger, filled only with a cold, terrifying certainty of his own righteousness. She did not describe the beatings in detail. She did not need to. The way she held herself, the way her voice broke on the word discipline, told the entire story. When she finished, a heavy silence fell upon the cabin once more. She felt raw, exposed, as if she had just flayed her own skin and laid her soul bare on the floor between them. She expected him to recoil in horror, or to offer clumsy words of pity that would feel like insults. She waited for the judgment that always followed a confession. Joshua remained silent for a long time. He picked up a small piece of wood from the floor beside him and his knife, and began to shave off a thin curl of wood. The scraping sound was the only reply. Mara watched him, a knot of shame and regret tightening in her chest. She should not have spoken. She had fouled his quiet home with her ugly past. "He never laid a hand on you in pity," Joshua said at last, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He wasn't looking at her, but at the piece of wood in his hands. Mara flinched. "What?" "Pity," he repeated, still not looking up. "A man like that, the kind who uses God as a whip, he'd see pity as a weakness, his and yours. The one thing he couldn't stand was for you to seem broken by it. He needed you to endure it, to prove his methods worked." She stared at him, stunned into silence. He had not offered sympathy. He had offered understanding. He had looked into the heart of her story and seen not her suffering, but the twisted logic of her tormentor. In that single stark observation, he had validated her entire experience in a way that no expression of sorrow ever could. He understood the shape of the monster she had fled. A single tear, hot and heavy, rolled down her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed since the fire. Another long silence passed. The fire had burned low again, and the cabin was growing cold. Finally, Joshua set down his knife and the half-formed bird he was carving. He looked at her directly, his gray eyes holding the flat, dead light of a winter sky. "My name isn't Joshua Rains," he said, his voice a low monotone. "Not the one I was born with. Anyway, the one I earned is probably written on a stack of wanted posters in some marshal's office, gathering dust." It was his turn. This was not a trade, but a balancing of scales. He had taken the weight of her story, and now he was offering her the weight of his. "I was a gun," he said, the words simple, brutal, and unadorned. "That's all. Some folks are blacksmiths, some are farmers. I was a gun, a rancher paid, and I cleared his land of homesteaders. A banker paid, and a rival found himself in an early grave. It was a trade. You get good at it. You learn not to think about it. You just see the job, see the silver eagle at the end of it, and you do what needs to be done." He spoke without bravado, without regret. It was a simple statement of fact, a recitation from a life that felt like it belonged to another man. "I was good at it," he continued, his eyes focused on some point in the dark past. "Too good. Made a name for myself. Made a fair bit of money. Enough to buy a small piece of land. Far away from all that. Enough to start over. I met a woman, Sarah. She didn't know who I'd been. To her, I was just a man with quiet hands who was good with horses. We had a son, Thomas." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. Mara could feel the raw, gaping wound of his past opening up in the small, dark room. "You can't outrun who you are," he said, his voice now barely a whisper. "You can change your name, change your town, but the things you've done, they have a long memory. A man I'd put down in a feud over grazing rights. His brothers came looking for me. They weren't interested in a fair fight. They were interested in making me pay." He looked at his own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "I wasn't home. I was in town, buying seed. They came to the ranch. They found Sarah and the boy." He stopped. He did not need to finish the story. The ending was written in the deep, desolate emptiness of his eyes. The hands that he had used to kill for money were the same hands that had built the home his family had died in. His trade had followed him, and had collected a debt he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay. "I found them when I got back," he said, his voice utterly flat. "And then I found the men who did it. I went back to being a gun for one last time, and when it was over, there was nothing left. The money, the land, the name, it was all poison. So I came here, to a place where the only sounds are the wind and the wood, and the only thing that needs killing is the man I used to be." He fell silent. Their two stories, stark and brutal, hung in the air between them, two pillars of pain marking the boundaries of their broken lives. She, the victim of a holy terror, who had become a killer to escape. He, the purveyor of a cold violence, who had become a hermit to atone. Mara looked at him, at this quiet, haunted man, and for the first time, she did not feel fear. She did not feel pity. She felt a profound, aching sense of recognition. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin, both survivors of a world that took more than it gave, both running from the ghosts of people they had left dead behind them. They did not need forgiveness, for there was none to be had. They did not need redemption, for they did not believe they were worthy of it. All they needed was a quiet room, a dying fire, and a single, silent witness who had seen the ugliest parts of their soul and had not looked away. In the deserted chapel of his remote cabin, they had held their own somber service, and for the first time, they were not entirely alone in their damnation. In the week that followed their confessions, the silence in the cabin changed again. It was no longer the empty, cautious silence of two strangers, nor the heavy, somber silence of a shared damnation. It became a quiet space of acceptance. There were no more secrets to guard, no more judgments to fear. They were two broken halves of a whole sorrow, and in that shared knowledge, a fragile peace began to take root. Mara started to move beyond the hearth. She took the chipped ceramic bowl from the table one morning, washed it with a slow, deliberate care, and filled it with wild berries she had gathered just outside the door. She left it on the table, an offering of her own, and watched from the doorway as Joshua came inside and ate a handful without a word. His nod of thanks barely perceptible, but present. It was a conversation. She found a length of twine and a needle in his meager supply box and began to mend her tattered dress. The simple, repetitive motion of the needle pulling the thread was a comfort, a small act of repair that mirrored the slow stitching of her own frayed nerves. She was no longer just a passive presence in his cabin. She was beginning to inhabit the space, to contribute to its quiet rhythm. Joshua, in turn, began to leave the cabin door open during the day, letting the sunlight and the scent of pine stream in. It was a small gesture, but for Mara, it was monumental. It was an acknowledgement that she was not a prisoner, that the ghosts she was hiding from were not waiting to pounce at the threshold. He even spoke more, his words no longer single, isolated stones dropped into a well of silence. He would name the birds that called from the treetops, or point to a distant peak and tell her its name. Simple things, facts of the world he had made his home. They were anchors, pulling her slowly back into the present. He took to playing his banjo on the porch in the evenings. The music was not joyful, but it wasn't entirely sad, either. It was a lonely, meandering sound, full of the vast, open spaces of the mountains. It was the sound of his solitude. But now, Mara was there to hear it. She would sit in the doorway, listening, the mournful notes weaving themselves into the fabric of the twilight. And for the first time in a decade, she felt something that resembled peace. It was on one such morning, when the air was crisp and the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue, that the peace was shattered. Joshua had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to check a series of snares he had set along a high ridge to the north. It was a task that took him away from the cabin for several hours, a walk that he usually found calming. It was a time to be alone with the mountains, to feel small and insignificant against their ancient majesty. He moved through the forest with a silence that was second nature, his steps sure-footed on the uneven ground. He reached the ridge just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, bathing the vast expanse of the valley below in a warm, golden light. From this vantage point, he could see for miles. He could see the silver ribbon of a distant river, the dark green carpet of the forest, and the faint, hazy smudge on the horizon that was the town she had fled from. He scanned the valley, his eyes tracking the flight of an eagle, and then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible plume of smoke, rising from a copse of aspen trees about 2 miles down the slope. It was in the wrong place. No trapper or hunter he knew would make a camp that close to the open meadows. It was a careless fire, a city fire. It was the fire of men who did not belong here. He went still, melting into the shadows of a granite outcrop. His eyes narrowed and sharp, fixed on the spot. He was a long way off, but his vision was keen, and the air was clear. After a few minutes, he saw movement. 3 figures on horseback, emerging from the trees. They were not riding with the easy lope of cowboys or the purpose of prospectors. They moved with a tense, searching deliberation, their heads constantly scanning the surrounding hillsides. They were looking for something, or someone. A cold, familiar dread settled in his gut. He remained perfectly still, watching as the riders fanned out, slowly making their way up the mountain in his direction. Even from this distance, he could see that 2 of the men wore the dark, sober clothing of townsfolk. The third man, however, was different. He sat his horse with a lazy, dangerous slouch. He wore a long, dusty coat, and the sun glinted off the rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. Joshua's blood ran cold. He knew that slouch. He knew the predatory stillness of that man. He had seen it across card tables, in smoky saloons, and over the barrels of drawn guns. The man's face was too distant to make out clearly, but the shape of him, the sheer lethal confidence he projected, was as familiar to Joshua as his own reflection. It was Jedediah Stone, a man who, like him, had once made a living from the finality of a well-placed bullet, a bounty hunter, a man-tracker, a man without a soul, who hunted other men for sport and silver. The presence of the other 2 men suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. They weren't lawmen. They were from the town, from the church. They had hired Jedediah Stone to do what they could not to navigate the wild places and hunt down a sinner, to find a woman who had dared to defy a man of God. And that meant the rumors had spread. The story of the fire and the dead minister had reached beyond the town, and a posse, cloaked in the cloth of righteousness, was now sweeping his mountain, and Jedediah Stone, a ghost from Joshua's own blood-soaked past, was leading them. The name he had buried, Caleb Black, felt like a live coal in his mind. Jedediah knew Caleb Black. They had ridden on opposite sides of a range war in Colorado once. Jedediah had a memory like a steel trap for faces and names, especially when there was money attached. Joshua backed away from the ridge, moving like a shadow through the trees. His mind was racing. The calm of the morning shattered. He was no longer Joshua Raines, the quiet man of the mountain. He was Caleb Black, the gunman, and his past was riding up the slope toward his front door. He reached the cabin, his heart a cold, heavy drum in his chest. Mara was outside, scattering feed for a pair of jays that had become her morning companions. She looked up as he approached, a small, tentative smile gracing her lips. But the smile vanished as she saw his face. The peace was gone from his eyes, replaced by the flat, hard look of a man staring down the barrel of a gun. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. He walked past her into the cabin, his eyes scanning the small space as if seeing it for the first time. He saw it now not as a sanctuary, but as a trap, a wooden box with 1 door and 1 small window, a place to be cornered. "There are men," he said, his back to her. "3 of them, on the mountain. They're coming this way." He heard her sharp intake of breath. He turned to face her. She stood in the doorway, her face ashen, her body rigid with a terror he now knew so well. The fragile healing of the past week had been undone in an instant. She was once again the hunted animal he had found in the woods. "They're looking for you," he said. It was a statement of fact, delivered in his old, cold voice. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, the cold, pragmatic logic of his former life resurfacing with terrifying ease. He saw the path of least resistance, the path Caleb Black would have taken. He could give her up. He could walk out to meet them, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He could play the part of the simple homesteader who had found a half-crazed woman collapsed on his land. Jedediah would be suspicious, but Jedediah only cared about the bounty. He wouldn't care about some mountain hermit unless that hermit got in his way. They would take Mara, They would lead her back to town, back to their righteous justice. There would be a trial, or perhaps not even that. A rope. It would be over. The men would leave his mountain. Jedediah none the wiser about who Joshua Rains really was. Everything would go back to the way it was. The silence would return. It would be clean, efficient, safe. All he had to do was step aside. All he had to do was sacrifice her. He looked at Mara. She was clutching the doorframe, her knuckles white. She was terrified, but she was not pleading. She was watching him, her dark eyes filled not with a plea for salvation, but with a terrible, knowing resignation. She had been abandoned and betrayed her whole life. She was expecting it again. She was expecting him to save himself. He saw the chipped bowl on the table. He saw her mended dress hanging from a peg. He heard the echo of his own banjo music from the night before, a lonely sound that had been for the first time. Not just for himself. He saw the woman who had trusted him with the story of her own private hell, who had listened to his without flinching. He had come to these mountains to kill Caleb Black, to starve the cold, selfish killer out of his soul. He had thought that solitude and time were the weapons to do it, but he was wrong. The real test was not in being alone. The real test was in this moment, the choice between his own safety and hers, the choice between running from his ghosts or finally turning to face them. To hand her over would be to admit that he had failed, that the man who carved birds was just a mask, and that underneath, the gunman was still there, still willing to trade a life for his own peace and quiet. It would be the final, ultimate act of cowardice. He had lost his family because he was not there to protect them. He could not fail again. A grim, hard resolve settled over him. He had been a fool to think he could ever find peace by running. Peace wasn't something you found. It was something you fought for. He walked past Mara to the far wall of the cabin, above the stone fireplace. Resting on two wooden pegs high on the wall was a long, heavy rifle. It was not a weapon he used often. It was his hunting rifle, a tool for survival. He had not touched it since Mara's arrival, not wanting any sign of a weapon in the house. He reached up and took it down. The weight of the rifle in his hands was familiar, heavy and final. It felt different from the pistols he had once carried. This was not a tool for killing men for money. This was a tool for defending a home. Mara watched him, her breath hitched in her throat. She did not know what the rifle meant, but she saw the decision in his eyes. He turned to her, his face a mask of grim determination. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, dangerous fire. "Stay away from the window," he said, his voice low and steady, "and bar the door." He was no longer weighing the options. The choice had been made. He was not giving her up. He was not stepping aside. The posse would find a woman in his cabin. Yes, but they would have to come through him to get to her. The ghosts of his past were riding up the mountain. And for the first time in his life, Joshua Rains was not going to run. He was going to stand his ground. The air, which had been clean and sharp in the morning, grew thick and heavy as the day wore on. A strange, yellow-gray light filtered through the pines, casting the world in a sickly pallor. The birds fell silent. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, began to mutter and then to snarl, rattling the single glass pane of the cabin's window. By late afternoon, the sky was the color of a deep bruise, a turbulent mass of dark, churning clouds that swallowed the mountains whole. Joshua stood on the porch, his back to the cabin, staring out at the approaching storm. He was not looking at the clouds. He was watching the forest, his eyes scanning the darkening woods with an intensity that made him seem like a part of the granite landscape. He was a man listening for a single discordant note in the symphony of the wilderness. Mara stood in the doorway behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She could feel the storm in her bones, a low, electric hum of anticipation that mirrored the terror in her heart. But as she watched Joshua's broad, unmoving back, she felt a new sensation mingling with the fear, a sliver of cold, hard resolve. He had not run. He had not cast her out. He had taken down a rifle, and in that simple, terrible action, he had bound his fate to hers. "It's coming," he said, his voice low, almost carried away by the rising wind. He was talking about more than the rain. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They'll wait for the storm to hit, use the noise in the dark to cover their approach." Jedediah was always patient. He spoke the name as if it were a curse, the sound of it a bitter memory on his tongue. He turned then, his face grim. "We have an hour, maybe 2. The first fat drop of rain hit the dusty ground of the clearing with a small puff. Then another, and another. Within minutes, a steady drumming began on the roof, quickly escalating into a roar as the heavens opened. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a gray, slanting sheet of water. Lightning cracked across the sky. A brilliant, jagged tear in the darkness, followed a heartbeat later by a clap of thunder that shook the very logs of the cabin. The storm was upon them. And with it, the work began. The pace of the cabin, which had been slow and deliberate for days, now became sharp, focused, and brutally efficient. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Joshua moved with a swift, deadly purpose that was terrifying and mesmerizing to watch. The quiet, gentle man who carved birds and played the banjo was gone. In his place was Caleb Black, the gunman, a man who understood the grim arithmetic of survival. "The ammunition box," he said, his voice clipped. "Under the cot." Mara moved without question. She knelt, her hands finding the rough wood of a small, heavy chest. She dragged it out. It was heavier than it looked. Joshua was beside her. He flipped the latches. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were the tools of his old trade: a mold for casting lead balls, a small crucible for melting, bars of lead, tins of black powder, and neatly wrapped packages of percussion caps. "We need more shot," he said, his hands already working, laying out the tools on the hearth. "You can feed the fire. Keep it hot." He handed her the bellows. Her hands, which had trembled uncontrollably just hours before, were now surprisingly steady as she pumped air onto the coals, coaxing them into a roaring heat. He worked opposite her, melting the lead in the crucible, the molten silver a dangerous, shimmering pool in the firelight. The cabin was filled with a new set of sounds: the roar of the rain on the roof, the howl of the wind, the crackle and spit of the fire, and the sharp, metallic clicks of Joshua preparing his weapons. He broke down the heavy rifle, cleaning the barrel with a practiced, fluid motion. His hands were sure, his focus absolute. He was a craftsman preparing for his most critical work. He spoke in short, sharp commands. "Tear that linen sack into strips. We need wadding." Mara found the sack and began to rip it into neat squares. Her fingers were clumsy at first, but soon she found a rhythm. Rip, fold, stack, rip, fold, stack. The simple, repetitive task focused her mind, pushing the terror into a small, tight corner. She was no longer just a victim waiting for her fate. She was a participant. Her hands were part of this defense. Joshua poured the molten lead into the mold, the hiss of the hot metal a venomous sound. A few moments later, he tapped the mold, and a half-dozen perfectly round, heavy lead balls dropped onto a stone beside the hearth. He repeated the process again and again. Each new set of bullets was a small victory against the encroaching darkness. They worked in near silence, a team forged in desperation. A flash of lightning would illuminate the cabin, freezing them in a stark tableau: the man, his face a mask of concentration, his hands covered in soot and oil; the woman, her hair wild, her eyes wide but calm, a pile of linen squares growing beside her. In those flashes, they would sometimes catch each other's eye. There was no time for words, no space for the softness of emotion. But in those shared glances, a universe of understanding passed between them. It was a look of grim resolve, of shared purpose, of a bond being tempered in the crucible of fear. It was the silent acknowledgement of two souls standing together at the edge of an abyss. When they had a small mound of freshly cast shot and a tall stack of wadding, Joshua turned his attention to the cabin itself. He took the heavy table and, with a grunt of effort, dragged it across the floor to brace it against the door. He then took the two chairs and wedged them under the window frame. "It won't stop a bullet," he said, gesturing to the thin glass pane, "but it might make them think twice before trying to come through." He moved to the corners of the cabin, his eyes tracing the lines of the log walls, searching for weaknesses. This small, sparse room was their entire world, their fortress, and he knew it was a fortress made of kindling. He took a length of rope and a small brass bell from his supply chest. He went to the door, opened it a crack, and disappeared into the lashing rain. Mara rushed to the door, her heart leaping into her throat. The thought of being alone, even for a moment, was unbearable. She watched as he worked, a dark, rain-slicked shape moving in the storm. He was tying the rope low to the ground, stretching it across the path to the porch, and attaching the other end to the bell, which he hung just inside the door frame. A simple tripwire, an early warning. He came back inside, soaked to the bone, water streaming from his hair and beard. He paid it no mind. He took his rifle, a powder horn, and a pouch of shot and caps, and moved to the corner of the room beside the window, a spot that gave him a clear line of sight to the door but kept him in deep shadow. He handed Mara a second, smaller rifle. It was lighter, a model for hunting small game. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. She shook her head. Silas had believed that weapons in a woman's hands were an abomination. "I'll show you once," he said. His voice was patient, but there was an urgency to it. He showed her how to measure the powder, how to seat the ball and wadding, how to place the percussion cap on the nipple. His hands guided hers, his touch impersonal, professional. "It kicks hard. Aim for the center of the chest. Don't think, just point and pull the trigger." She took the rifle, its weight both terrifying and reassuring. She had brought a life into this world with an iron poker. Now she held a tool that could end a life from a distance. The thought sent a chill through her, but she held the weapon steady. With the preparations complete, a new kind of silence fell over the cabin. A waiting silence. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic orchestra of wind and rain and thunder. Inside, there was only the sound of their breathing and the frantic, silent beating of their own hearts. They were ready. There was nothing left to do but wait for the darkness outside to produce the men who were hunting her. Mara sat on the floor, her back against the wall, the small rifle across her lap. Joshua stood in the shadows near the window, a tall, unmoving sentinel. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar objects of the cabin into monstrous shapes. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut to the point of breaking. She looked at him, his profile etched by the firelight. He was staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the storm-tossed forest. He had done all this for her, a stranger. He had risked his peace, his safety, his very life, for a woman whose name he barely knew. She had given him her story of pain, and he had answered with this terrible, selfless act of protection. "Joshua," she said, her voice a low, steady sound in the roaring silence. He didn't turn, but she knew he was listening. She took a deep breath. She had faced the worst of one man's evil. She knew what awaited her if she was taken back. The humiliation, the judgment, the slow, righteous cruelty of men who believed they were doing God's work. She would not go back to that. She would rather face the clean, final judgment of God himself. "If the worst happens," she said, her voice clear and without a tremor, "if they get in, don't let them take me alive." The request hung in the air, stark and absolute. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a demand for a final, terrible kindness. Joshua turned his head slowly and looked at her. His eyes, in the flickering light, were dark and deep, and they held a profound, sorrowful understanding. He had seen what happened to people who were taken alive. He knew the ugliness of a mob, the cold sport of a hanging. He understood, better than anyone, that there were fates far worse than a quick, clean death. He saw the terror behind her calm resolve, and he recognized it as the same terror that had driven him to these mountains. It was the terror of being caged. He did not speak. He did not offer empty promises that it would not come to that. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and then he gave a single, sharp nod. It was a vow, a solemn promise made in the heart of a storm, between two broken people who had nothing left to lose but the small, defiant freedom of choosing their own end. The nod was all the answer she needed. A strange calm settled over her. The trembling in her hands stopped completely. The wire of tension inside her did not break, but it hummed now with a clear, resonant note of purpose. She was no longer just Mara Bell, the runaway wife. She was a woman with a rifle in her hands, a guardian at her back, and a final, terrible choice that was her own to make. They settled back into the waiting. The thunder cracked overhead like a gunshot, and the rain lashed against the cabin, trying to beat its way in. But inside, there were two people, ready for the other storm that was coming. The storm broke just as the night began to die. The torrential downpour, which had been a deafening, continuous roar, softened into a steady, whispering drizzle. The thunder, which had shaken the mountains, retreated into a low, distant grumble. A pale, gray light, the color of dirty dishwater, began to seep through the trees, outlining the world in soft, blurred edges. This was the moment of greatest danger, the moment between the cover of darkness and the clarity of day. Inside the cabin, the tension was a living, breathing thing. Every nerve was stretched taut. Mara sat with her back pressed against the log wall, the small hunting rifle resting heavy and cold across her knees. Her ears strained to hear anything beyond the drip of water from the eaves and the soft hiss of the fire. Across the room, Joshua was a statue carved from shadow. He stood motionless beside the window, his large rifle held at a low ready, his gaze fixed on the misty clearing. They had not slept. They had only waited. Then it came. A sound so small, so out of place, that it was almost lost in the dripping of the rain. A tiny, metallic tinkle. The bell. Joshua's head moved a fraction of an inch. His eyes met Mara's in the dim light. It was a look that needed no words. They are here. Mara's heart, which had been a frantic drum all night, seemed to stop altogether. She tightened her grip on the rifle, the wood smooth and alien against her palms. The silence that followed the bell was more terrifying than the storm had been. It was a silence filled with purpose, a silence that was crawling toward them through the mud and the mist. A voice called out from the clearing, trying to sound friendly, but the strain of it was as taut as a fiddle string. "Hello, the cabin, we're travelers. Lost in the storm, in need of shelter." It was one of the townsmen, the voice of false piety. Joshua remained utterly still. He raised one hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, and pressed a single finger to his lips. They would not answer. They would not give away their positions. A few moments of tense silence. Then the voice came again, closer this time, laced with impatience. "Hello, is anyone in there? We mean no harm." The lie was so bald, so transparent, that Mara felt a flicker of cold anger through her fear. They meant all the harm in the world. The heavy thud of a boot hit the porch, then another. Footsteps, slow and cautious, creaked across the wooden planks. A shadow fell across the single window. Mara held her breath. A hand rattled the door latch. It held firm against the barricade. "It's barred," the voice muttered, no longer friendly. Then a louder voice, this one with a hard, gravelly edge that cut through the damp air. "Jedediah Stone, I told you this was a waste of time. He knows we're here. Kick it in." The command was followed by a tremendous crash as a heavy boot slammed into the door. The wood groaned, and the table braced against it scraped backward a few inches across the floor. Mara flinched. A small, involuntary jerk. Another crash, harder this time. A thin crack appeared in one of the door's thick planks. Joshua moved. He was not a man anymore. He was pure, lethal motion. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, aimed not at the center of the door, but high and to the left of the latch. He squeezed the trigger. The explosion inside the small cabin was deafening. It was a physical blow, a concussive force that slammed into Mara's chest and made her ears ring. A plume of acrid, gray smoke filled the air, stinging her eyes and nose. A hole the size of a man's fist appeared in the door, splintered wood flying outward. A sharp cry of pain and surprise came from the porch, followed by a frantic scrambling sound and a volley of curses. The first shot had been fired. There was no going back. "Fools!" Jedediah's voice snarled from the trees. "Spread out, he's alone. Cover the window." The world outside erupted. A gunshot cracked from the left, and the cabin's single window exploded inward, showering the floor with a spray of glittering glass. Mara cried out, throwing her arm up to shield her face as a lead ball whistled past her head and thudded into the log wall behind her. Joshua was already moving, dropping to one knee in the corner, the deep shadows concealing him. He rammed a new load down the barrel of his rifle with a swift, mechanical efficiency that seemed impossible in the dim light. He was no longer a man of peace. He was a creature of violence, returned to his natural element. Another shot came from the right, splintering the window frame. They were caught in a crossfire. The two townsmen, emboldened by their leader, were laying down a covering fire while Jedediah, the true threat, remained unseen. "He's pinned," one of the men shouted, his voice high with a mix of fear and excitement. "I'm going for the door." Mara saw a shape move on the porch through the shattered window. It was the first man, the one who had cried out. He was clutching his arm, but in his other hand, he held a pistol. He was preparing to rush the door, to use the opening Joshua's shot had made. Joshua was focused on the tree line to the right, his eyes scanning for the telltale puff of smoke that would give away Jedediah's position. He didn't see the man on the porch. He was exposed. Time seemed to slow down. Mara saw it all with a terrible, crystalline clarity. The man on the porch raising his pistol, Joshua, intent on the greater threat, oblivious to the immediate one, the certainty of what was about to happen. A choice, sharp and clear as a shard of glass, presented itself. She could cower, she could scream, or she could act. The memory of Joshua's nod in the darkness, the silent vow that he would not let them take her, flashed through her mind. He had chosen to stand for her. Now, she had to stand for him. Her hands, which felt clumsy and numb, brought the small rifle up. It was heavy, unwieldy. She rested the barrel on her knee to steady it. She looked down the long, dark length of it, trying to remember his instructions. Aim for the center. Don't think, just pull. She could see the man on the porch clearly now. His face was contorted in a mask of grim determination. He was taking aim at Joshua's back. Mara closed her eyes. She could not watch. She pictured the center of his dark coat, and she pulled the trigger. The small rifle bucked against her shoulder with a force that felt like a punch, knocking the breath from her lungs. The explosion was sharp, a high-pitched crack compared to the deep boom of Joshua's weapon. She opened her eyes. The man on the porch was gone. He had not fallen. He had staggered backward, a look of pure, comical surprise on his face, and tumbled off the side of the porch, disappearing into the wet gloom. The distraction, the sudden cessation of fire from the porch, was all the opening Joshua needed. But Jedediah was a professional. He used the moment not to attack, but to move. A flash of movement from the right, a dark shape darting between two large pines. Joshua swung his rifle, firing from the hip. The shot was rushed. It missed, chewing a chunk of bark from a tree just behind where Jedediah had been. And then a shot answered from the trees. It was not a wild, panicked shot like the townsman's. It was a calm, deliberate, professional shot. Joshua cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He stumbled back, his rifle clattering to the floor. He clutched at his left shoulder, his hand coming away dark with blood. "Joshua!" Mara screamed, the name torn from her throat. He staggered, but he did not fall. He leaned against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat, his teeth gritted against the pain. "The other one," he gasped, his eyes wild. "The last one." Jedediah Stone stepped out from behind the trees. He moved with a lazy, confident swagger, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He was reloading, taking his time. He thought the fight was over. He had wounded his man. The woman was no threat. He had won. But he had misjudged them both. Joshua pushed himself off the wall. He ignored his own fallen rifle. In his belt, tucked against the small of his back, was a large, heavy knife. His hand went to it. He was wounded, his primary weapon lost. He was at a disadvantage, but he was not beaten. He launched himself through the doorway, a low, desperate cry of rage on his lips. He charged out into the rain and the mud, a wounded bear determined to take his attacker down with him. Jedediah looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He raised his rifle, but it was too late. Joshua was on him. The two men crashed together in a brutal, desperate struggle. They went down in the mud, rolling, grappling, two beasts fighting for dominance. A shot went wild, firing harmlessly into the sky. Mara could hear their grunts, the wet, sickening thud of fists on flesh, the desperate gasps for air. Then, a third figure appeared, the last townsman. He had circled around the cabin and now stood at the edge of the clearing, his pistol raised, a look of terrified indecision on his face. He didn't know who to shoot. The two men on the ground were a tangled, writhing mass of limbs. Mara knew she couldn't reload in time. She dropped the empty rifle and scrambled for Joshua's. It was heavy, too heavy for her to lift and aim properly. She dragged it across the floor to the doorway, resting the barrel on the threshold. She took aim. The man saw her. He turned, his pistol swinging toward her. Fear gave her a strange, cold clarity. She did not close her eyes this time. She looked straight at him, and she fired. The heavy rifle slammed back into her shoulder, a brutal, punishing blow. The man in the clearing spun around, a dark hole appearing in his chest, and collapsed into a heap. In the same instant, a final, choked cry came from the two men struggling in the mud. One figure rose, slick with mud and blood. It was Joshua. He stood swaying for a moment, the long, dark knife in his hand dripping. At his feet, Jedediah Stone lay still. Silence. A profound, absolute silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the soft, steady dripping of the rain. The storm was over. The fight was over. The smell of gun smoke and wet earth and something else, something coppery and metallic, filled the air. Mara stared out at the scene, at the three still forms, lying like broken dolls in the mud. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The strength that had held her together, the adrenaline and the terror, drained away all at once, leaving her utterly, completely empty. The heavy rifle slipped from her numb fingers, landing with a thud on the floor. She stumbled out of the cabin, her bare feet sinking into the cold, soft mud. She walked a few steps into the clearing, into the midst of the carnage she had helped create. She looked at her hands. They were trembling violently. These were the hands that had taken a life, 2 lives. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her. She sank to her knees, the mud cold and wet against her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, but she couldn't stop shaking. She stared blankly at the scene, her mind a complete and utter void. She was not a wife. She was not a victim. She was a killer. The rain mingled with the tears she didn't realize she was crying, washing the soot and the horror from her face. She sat there, a silent, unmoving figure in the center of the devastation, a stone in the middle of a bloody forest. She heard a slow, pained shuffling behind her. Joshua. He was holding his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of pain, but he was on his feet. He walked to her, his steps unsteady, leaving a trail of blood in the mud behind him. He stopped beside her. He did not speak. He did not offer words of comfort or justification. He knew there were none that would suffice. He simply knelt beside her in the mud, his movements slow and agonizing. And then he placed his good hand on her shoulder. The touch was not soft. It was not gentle. It was firm, solid, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. It was the touch of a survivor. It was a silent, profound statement that passed between them without the need for words. We are still here. You are not alone in this. His hand was steady and as strong as the trunk of an old oak. And Mara, without looking up, leaned into its solid, grounding weight. The rain fell for the rest of that day, a soft, gray curtain that washed the clearing clean. It turned the blood-soaked mud into a dark, rich earth and cleansed the air of the acrid smell of gunpowder, replacing it with the clean scent of wet pine and damp soil. The storm, having spent its fury, now seemed to be weeping, a quiet, sorrowful lament for the violence that had taken place. They did not speak of the dead. There were no words that could contain the horror of what had happened. When the drizzle finally stopped and a pale, watery sun broke through the clouds, the work began. It was a grim, silent task. Joshua, his left arm bound tightly to his chest in a makeshift sling Mara had fashioned from a bedsheet, could not dig. His face was a pale, tight mask of pain, and a feverish heat was already beginning to radiate from his skin. He directed her with a few terse words, his voice strained. There, by the outcropping, the ground is softer. Mara took the shovel. The wood was smooth and worn, the iron blade heavy and cold. She began to dig. The work was brutal. The wet earth was heavy, and the ground was thick with rocks and roots. Her hands, soft from a life of indoor work, blistered and then broke, the raw skin stinging with every shovelful. She ignored the pain. It was a penance, a physical agony to distract from the deeper, spiritual one. They dragged the bodies one by one to the shallow graves she had dug. They were heavy, inert sacks of flesh, their faces peaceful and empty in a way that was more disturbing than any expression of violence could have been. Jedediah Stone's eyes were open, staring blankly at the gray sky. Mara could not bring herself to close them. She simply rolled him into the earth and began to shovel the dirt back in. They did not say a prayer. They did not speak a eulogy. The dead had come with malice in their hearts, and they had been met with the same. To offer words of grace over their bodies would have been a hypocrisy neither of them could stomach. The only sound was the scrape and thud of the shovel, the heavy breathing of a wounded man, and the quiet sobs of a woman burying the ghosts of her past. When it was done, 3 rough mounds of earth scarred the clearing. The only marker of the battle was the shattered window of the cabin and the dark, ominous stains on the porch that the rain had not quite washed away. With the dead returned to the earth, the needs of the living became paramount. Joshua's fever took hold. By nightfall, he was delirious, his skin burning to the touch. He lay on the cot, tossing and turning, muttering names she did not recognize. Sarah. Thomas, his voice thick with an ancient, unresolved grief. The roles were now completely reversed. Mara, who had been the helpless refugee, became the sole keeper of their small, fragile world. The fear did not leave her, but it was forced into the background by the sheer, overwhelming press of necessity. She had to keep the fire going. She had to fetch water from the creek, a terrifying journey that made her feel exposed and vulnerable with every step. She had to find a way to get food into a man who could not feed himself. She found his meager stores dried beans, a little flour, salted pork. She made a thin broth, boiling the salt pork until it softened, and spent hours coaxing spoonfuls of it between his cracked lips. She bathed his face with cool water from the creek, trying to bring the fever down. She cleaned and redressed his wound, a gruesome task that made her stomach churn. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, but the wound was angry and inflamed. Following his earlier, lucid instructions, she made a poultice of yarrow leaves she found growing near the creek, her hands clumsy but her purpose firm. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not truly sleep. She drifted in a state of exhausted watchfulness, her ear tuned to every change in his breathing. In the long, quiet hours of the night, with only the fire and the unconscious man for company, she confronted the enormity of what had happened. The ghosts of the men she had killed did not haunt her. Her mind, in a strange act of self-preservation, refused to dwell on their faces. The true ghost was the woman she had been. That silent, frightened creature who flinched at every raised voice seemed like a stranger from another life. The woman who now packed a wound with herbs and stood with a rifle by the door when a deer snapped a twig in the forest was someone new. Someone forged in the crucible of that terrible dawn. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She woke from a light doze to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. They were filled with a weary pain, but the delirium was gone. "Water," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. She brought it to him, her hands steady as she held the tin cup to his lips. He drank deeply. He looked from her face to the newly cleaned cabin, to the small stack of firewood she had gathered, to the rifle leaning in the corner where she had left it. He saw everything. He didn't speak of it. He didn't have to. His recovery was slow, but his constitution was strong. As he regained his strength, a new rhythm established itself, a life that was measured not in days of the week, for they had lost all track, but in the simple, repeating cycle of tasks. These were the unnamed days. As soon as he could stand, he began to teach her. His body was weak, but his will was not. He could no longer provide for them both alone, so he began to give her the tools to provide for herself. He took her to the small, hidden corral where he kept a few half-wild horses. He showed her how to approach a horse not with force, but with a quiet confidence that spoke of a lack of fear. "They feel what you feel," he told her, his voice still weak. "If you're scared, they'll be scared." He taught her how to saddle and bridle the calmest of the mares, his one good hand guiding hers. Her first time on horseback was terrifying. The world seemed to tilt and sway from such a height. But he walked beside her, his hand on the bridle, his presence a steadying force. He didn't offer praise, only quiet, practical corrections. "Sit deeper, heels down. Look where you're going, not at the ground." Slowly, the fear gave way to a thrilling sense of freedom, to be able to move faster than her own 2 feet, to feel the wind in her hair, was a revelation. It was the opposite of the cage she had lived in. He taught her how to shoe his mule, a cantankerous animal named Silas, a coincidence that gave Mara a grim, private satisfaction. It was hard, filthy work. She learned the smell of a hot forge, the feel of a hammer in her hand, the precise strength it took to drive a nail into a hoof without injuring the animal. Her hands grew calloused, her arms strong. He taught her how to read the clouds, to know when a storm was coming. He showed her which plants were medicine and which were poison. He made her practice loading and firing both rifles until the motions were second nature, until the recoil no longer made her flinch. This was not a preparation for another battle. It was an education in survival. He was giving her a gift more precious than any jewel, the ability to stand on her own. And he taught her the most important lesson of all, how to be silent without being lonely. They would spend hours working on opposite sides of the clearing. He mending a harness with his one good hand, she learning to tan a deer hide he had stored. They did not speak, but the silence was a comfortable, living thing between them. It was filled with the sounds of their work, with the rustle of the wind, with the knowledge of each other's presence. The heavy, watchful silence of her past had been a prison. This new, shared silence was a wide, open meadow. It was peace. Their life was not poetic. It was a hard, elemental existence. They were often hungry. They were always tired. The specter of what had happened never truly left. It was a permanent shadow at the edge of their vision. But in the midst of this harsh reality, there was a quiet, unbelievable sense of calm. There were no expectations. There were no demands. There were no twisted scriptures or angry fists. There was only the rising of the sun, the work of the day, and the falling of the night. They never spoke of their pasts again. The stories had been told, the burdens shared. To speak of them again would be to give them a power they no longer deserved. And they did not speak of the future. The future was a luxury they could not afford. There was only the present moment, this unnamed day, and the task at hand. Their intimacy was woven into the fabric of this simple routine. It was in the way she would leave a hot cup of coffee on the stool beside him in the morning before he woke. It was in the way he would leave a perfectly carved, smooth-sanded bird on the mantel for her to find. It was in the way their hands would sometimes brush when she passed him a tool, a brief, electric contact that spoke more than 1,000 words. They had never kissed. They had never touched in any way beyond what was necessary for tending a wound or teaching a skill. The bond between them was not one of passion, but of something far deeper, something forged in blood and silence. It was a bond of mutual witness. He had seen the depths of her suffering, and she had seen the darkness of his soul, and they had both chosen to stay. Each morning they would sit on the porch, a few feet apart, and drink their coffee as the sun rose. They would watch as the light slowly illuminated the valley, chasing the shadows from the deep green pines. They would not speak, but in the shared ritual, in the quiet companionship, a silent vow was made and remade with every sunrise. It was a promise of shared burdens, of mutual protection, of a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. It was the simple, profound, unspoken truth that here, in this wild and lonely place, they had found a reason to keep living. The unnamed days bled one into the next, and the season began to turn. The deep, vibrant green of the high summer pines was now tinged with the coming gold of autumn. The air grew a sharper edge, carrying the crisp, clean scent of approaching frost. The nights grew longer, the darkness deeper, and the fire in the hearth became less of a comfort and more of a necessity. A new kind of life had taken root in the small cabin. It was a life of quiet partnership, of shared labor and unspoken understanding. Mara's hands, once soft and pale, were now strong and calloused, as adept at skinning a rabbit or resetting a trap as they were at kneading dough for their daily bread. She moved with a newfound confidence, her body lean and strong, her gaze steady and clear. She was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of a room. She was a woman who inhabited her own skin, who knew the weight of an axe and the heft of a rifle. Joshua's wound had healed into a puckered, angry scar on his shoulder, a permanent reminder of the violence that had brought them together. The haunted look never entirely left his eyes, but its edges had softened. He played his banjo more often, and sometimes the lonely melodies held a note of something that was not quite hope, but was no longer pure despair. He had taught her how to survive in his world, and in doing so, had found a reason to fully live in it himself. They were two solitary trees that had, by some strange twist of fate, grown so close that their roots had intertwined. They drew strength from each other, their shared silence a bulwark against the ghosts of their separate pasts. The cabin was no longer his sanctuary and her refuge. It was their home. The outside world had ceased to exist. It was a half-forgotten dream of towns and noise and other people, until one afternoon, when the world intruded. A man emerged from the tree line, leading a pack mule. He was old and grizzled, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his buckskins worn and stained from a lifetime spent in the wilderness. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. Joshua saw him long before he reached the clearing. He was on the porch, oiling the rifle, and he did not stop his work, but a familiar stillness fell over him. Mara, who was inside grinding coffee, felt the shift in the atmosphere. She came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her body instantly on alert. The old trapper stopped at the edge of the clearing, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. "Howdy, folks. Name's Elias. Just passing through. Headed down to Willow Creek for supplies before the snow flies." Joshua gave a curt nod. "Elias, didn't figure on seeing nobody up this high," the old man said, his eyes taking in the neat cabin, the corral with the horses, and Mara standing in the doorway. "Thought you was just a rumor." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground, heard strange things down in the valley. A cold premonition washed over Mara. She felt the hair on her arms stand on end. "Folks in town are all stirred up," Elias continued, oblivious to the sudden, icy tension in the clearing. "Talking about the fire out at Reverend Bell's place. Found 3 men dead up in the hills a few weeks back. One of them was a known bounty man, Jedediah Stone." Joshua's hands stopped their methodical work. He set the oil rag down with a slow, deliberate motion. "But that ain't the strangest part," Elias said, warming to his story. "The strangest part is the Reverend himself. Turns out, he ain't dead." The world seemed to stop. The wind died in the trees. The birds fell silent. Mara felt the blood drain from her face, a dizzying, sickening rush. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. Not dead. The words were a death knell. "No, sir," Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "Tough old bird, that one. Skull cracked something fierce, they say. He was out of his head for a month. But he's back now, back in the pulpit. And the sermons he's preaching, fire and brimstone ain't the half of it." The trapper's eyes flickered to Mara, a flicker of dawning recognition and pity in them. He's talking about his wayward wife, about the sinner who tried to murder him and burn down his house, about his property that was stolen from him by the devil. He's put a reward out, a big one. Says he wants her brought back, to be saved. Mara heard the words, but they seemed to come from a great distance. She felt the cold sweat of her old fear, the familiar, paralyzing terror that had been her constant companion for a decade. She felt the phantom grip of his hand in her hair, heard the hiss of his voice as he called her purification holy. The cage she had escaped from was being rebuilt around her, its bars forged from his words and the town's righteous fury. She was going to be dragged back. She looked at Joshua. His face was a thunderhead. A cold, bleak fury had settled in his eyes, a darkness she had not seen since the night of the storm. It was the face of Caleb Black. Elias, sensing he had overstayed his welcome, tipped his hat. "Well, I'd best be on my way. Winter don't wait for no man." He tugged on the mule's lead rope and disappeared back into the trees, leaving his words hanging in the air like a poison. For a long time, neither of them moved. The fragile peace of their world had been irrevocably shattered. The past was not dead. It was alive, and it was coming for them. It was Joshua who broke the silence. He rose to his feet, the rifle in his hand. "Get your things," he said, his voice flat and hard. Mara stared at him, confused. "What?" "Pack what you can carry. Food, a blanket. There's a cave on the far side of the mountain. It's dry. You'll be safe there for a few days." She understood then, his plan. His face was a mask of grim resolve. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to lead them away," he said, his eyes not meeting hers. "He's not looking for you. He's looking for the man he thinks stole you. I'll leave a clear trail. Head south. By the time they realize it's a false one, you'll be long gone. You can head north, up into the high country. You have the skills now. You can survive." It was the plan of a gunman, a plan of sacrifice and evasion. He was going to draw the fire, to offer himself up to the ghosts of his past in order to save her. He was going to run, just as he had been running his whole life. He was protecting her, but he was also protecting himself from the possibility of another failure, another loss. The old Mara would have wept with gratitude. The old Mara would have done as she was told, would have taken the chance he was offering and fled into the wilderness. But the old Mara was dead. She had been burned to ashes in the fire of her husband's cabin and buried in the mud of this clearing. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it had the force of a gunshot in the silent air. Joshua turned to look at her, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. "There's no time to argue. Mara, this is the only way." "No," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. She stepped away from the doorway and walked toward him, her head held high. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. It was a passenger now, and a new, unyielding resolve was at the helm. "I'm not going to a cave. I'm not heading for the high country. I am done with running." "You don't understand," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't just your husband, the man he hired, Jedediah. He had friends. They'll send more men like him. Professionals. This is not a fight you can win." "Perhaps," she said, stopping just before him. She looked up into his tormented face. "But it is a fight I will have. You taught me how to ride. You taught me how to shoot. You taught me how to survive. Did you teach me all that just so I could run better?" He stared at her, his jaw tight. He had no answer. "For 10 years, she said, her voice low and fierce. "I lived in a cage. I prayed for an escape. When I came here, I thought this was it, but I was wrong. The cage isn't a place. Joshua, it's a fear you carry inside you, and it doesn't matter how far you run. It will always be with you, until you turn and face it." She reached out and put her hand on his chest, a gesture of shocking intimacy. "You have been running your whole life. I have been running my whole life. Look at us. It ends here, for both of us." Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but her words were like steel. "No one needs to run anymore." He looked down at her hand on his chest, and then into her eyes. He saw no fear there now, only a calm, unwavering strength that mirrored the mountains around them. He saw that he had succeeded too well. He had taught her to be a survivor, and she had learned the lesson so completely that she would no longer allow him to make her a victim, even in the name of protecting her. To force her to run now would be to deny her the very personhood she had fought and killed to reclaim. A long, slow breath escaped his lips, and the hard mask of Caleb Black began to dissolve. The cold fury in his eyes softened into a weary, profound respect. He had come here to save himself, and had ended up saving her. And now, she was saving him. He gave a single, slow nod. The argument was over. The preparation for this battle was different from the last. There was no frantic urgency, no panicked haste. It was a cold, methodical, and grimly determined affair. They worked as a single, silent unit. They reinforced the door and the window with green logs that would not easily burn. They cleared the brush around the cabin, leaving no cover for 100 yards. They brought water in from the creek, enough to last a week. They cast every last ounce of lead they had into bullets. Mara worked beside him, her movements sure and steady. She cleaned and loaded the rifles with a practiced efficiency. She was no longer afraid of the weapons. They were tools, and she knew how to use them. They planned their defense, their voices low and calm in the firelight. They were two generals planning a campaign, two sovereigns defending their small, quiet kingdom. They were ready. They waited. 1 day passed, then 2. The autumn air grew colder. The leaves on the aspen trees turned a brilliant, fiery yellow. The world was beautiful and vibrant, a stark contrast to the grim expectation that hung over the cabin. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that moved at the edge of the clearing, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. On the 3rd evening, as dusk was settling, they saw a figure approaching. It was Elias, the old trapper, on his way back from town. Joshua met him on the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hand. Mara stood in the doorway, her own rifle just inside. Elias looked from Joshua's hard face to Mara's resolute one, and then at the newly reinforced cabin. He nodded slowly. "Figured it might be something like this," he said, his voice low. He dismounted from his mule. "You folks can stand down. The fight's over." Joshua's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The Reverend," Elias said, pulling a pouch of tobacco from his coat. "He ain't comin'." Mara's heart pounded against her ribs. It was a trick. It had to be. "News hit town this morning," the trapper continued, stuffing his pipe. "A freight driver found him about 5 miles out of town, on the road heading this way, lying in a ditch, necks broken." Mara and Joshua stared at him, speechless. Elias lit his pipe, the flare of the match illuminating his wrinkled face. "Looks like he was roaring drunk. Must have fallen clean off his horse and hit his head on a rock." Folks say the whiskey bottle was still clutched in his hand. He took a long draw from his pipe and blew a cloud of smoke into the cool evening air. The Lord works in mysterious ways. I reckon, or maybe, sometimes, a bad man just meets a bad end all on his own. The trapper stayed only a few more minutes, then mounted his mule and disappeared into the twilight, leaving them alone with the staggering, unbelievable news. The threat was gone. The great monstrous shadow that had haunted Mara's life had not been vanquished in a blaze of glory or a hail of bullets. It had simply stumbled. It had died a pathetic, lonely, drunken death in a ditch. There was no victory. There was no catharsis. There was no final, heroic confrontation. There was only a profound, disorienting silence. The war they had braced themselves for had ended before it even began. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, ignominious sound of a man falling off his horse. They stood on the porch as the last light faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The rifles they had prepared for battle leaned against the cabin wall, suddenly feeling like useless, heavy artifacts from another life. It was not a victory. They had not won. They had simply survived. The true battle had not been against Silas Bell, the man. It had been against the crushing weight of the past, and with his pathetic, unceremonious death, that weight had finally been lifted. They were left not with the spoils of war, but with something far more precious and far more terrifying a future. An empty, unnamed, an uncertain future that was now, finally, theirs to live. The scars on the land healed first. The 3 rough mounds by the granite outcropping, which for a year had been a stark and ugly reminder, were slowly reclaimed. First came the weeds, then the wild grasses, and finally a scattering of pine saplings, their green shoots a stubborn testament to the inexorable persistence of life. The seasons turned, a slow, patient wheel grinding the sharp edges of memory into something smoother, more distant. The snows of 10 winters fell, burying the past in a deep, silent white, and the suns of 10 summers rose, warming the earth and coaxing new life from the old. The cabin, too, changed. It grew. With logs he felled and she helped him hew. They added another room, and then a small, sturdy barn. They cleared more land. Not with the frantic energy of survival, but with the slow, steady rhythm of building a future. They built a corral, its fence strong and true, and began to raise horses. Not for money, not at first, but for the simple, quiet satisfaction of it. The horses were of a fine, sturdy stock, known for their calm temperament and sure-footedness on the mountain trails. Travelers and prospectors, making their way through the high passes of the Bitterroot Range, began to speak of a place, a small, isolated ranch nestled in a high valley. That was not on any map. They called it the Rains Place. It was run by an unusual couple. The man, Joshua, was quiet, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world, but his hands were gentle with the horses. The woman, Mara, spoke even less than her husband, but there was a deep, settled peace in her eyes that strangers found strangely calming. They were not rich, they were not sociable, but their reputation, carried on the slow currents of mountain gossip, was one of simple, unwavering decency. A traveler with a lame horse would be offered a fresh mount, with payment being a simple handshake and a promise to send the horse back when they reached a town. A family whose wagon had broken an axle would find shelter. a warm meal, and the quiet, efficient help of a man who could fix almost anything with his hands. No one who stopped at the Rains place ever left empty-handed. They left with a full belly, a rested horse, or a mended wheel. But more than that, they left with a feeling they couldn't quite name. It was a sense of peace, a feeling of having stepped out of the noisy, striving world and into a place where the old, simple virtues still held true. They would ride away feeling a little lighter, their own troubles seeming a little smaller in the vast, quiet majesty of the mountains. One late summer afternoon, a family of homesteaders, a man and a woman with their young son, stopped at the ranch. Their boy, who was perhaps 7 or 8 years of age, had been taken with a fever, and they were desperate for a safe place to rest for a night. Mara took the boy in without a word, bathing his forehead with cool water and giving him a spoonful of willow bark tea, a remedy Joshua had taught her. Joshua helped the father tend to their tired oxen. By evening, the boy's fever had lessened, and he sat on the porch steps, watching Joshua with wide, curious eyes. Joshua sat on his stool, his banjo across his knee, his fingers plucking a soft, meandering melody that seemed to be a conversation with the setting sun. Mara came out and sat in the doorway, a bowl of beans in her lap, which she was shelling for their dinner. The setting sun bathed the clearing in a warm, golden light, and the notes of the banjo were the only sound, a gentle, melancholy punctuation to the profound silence. The boy watched the quiet couple. He saw the way Joshua would sometimes pause his playing and look over at Mara. He saw the way she would look up from her work, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, before looking back down at the beans. There were no words between them, but the air was thick with a kind of communication he did not understand. Finally, his childish curiosity could hold back no longer. He looked up at Joshua, his small face serious. "Mister," he asked, his voice clear in the quiet air, "what is love?" The question, so simple and so vast, hung in the golden light. The banjo music stopped. The rhythmic snap of the beans in Mara's bowl ceased. The world seemed to hold its breath. Joshua looked down at the boy, and then his gaze lifted and found Mara's. In that single, silent look, a lifetime passed between them. It was a look that held the memory of blood and fire, of a desperate flight through a dark forest, of a shared confession in a firelit cabin, of a grim vow made in the heart of a storm. It held the memory of blistered hands and shared labor, of lonely banjo notes and quiet morning coffees. It was a look that acknowledged the shattered pieces of their former lives, the ugly, jagged edges that could never be fully erased. He turned his gaze back to the boy. A faint, weary smile touched his lips, a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, but held a universe of truth within it. "Son," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Love. Love is knowing someone was shattered into 100 pieces, and finding you like the way the light shines through the cracks." He paused, his eyes finding Mara's again. "It's wanting to stay and help them hold the pieces for the rest of your life." The boy considered this for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then, satisfied with the answer, he turned his attention to a beetle crawling on the porch steps. The conversation was over. The next morning, the family left, their son's fever gone, their hearts full of a quiet gratitude. They rode away feeling lighter, their own future seeming a little brighter. Mara and Joshua stood on the porch, watching them go. When they were out of sight, he reached out and, for the first time in all their years together, he did not just brush her hand. He took it, his calloused, scarred fingers wrapped around hers, her own hand, equally calloused, fitting perfectly into his. They did not speak. They simply stood together, hand in hand, and watched the sunrise. The light spilled over the eastern peaks, a brilliant, clean promise of a new day. It illuminated the clearing, the sturdy barn, the strong fences of the corral. It glinted off the glass of the window they had replaced long ago, and just inside that window, Hanging in a small clay pot Mara had made with her own hands was a spray of lavender, its pale purple flowers, a symbol of peace and devotion, caught the morning light, their gentle scent a quiet, constant prayer. The past was not dead. Its scars remained, on their bodies and in their souls, like the healed-over mounds in the clearing, but it no longer had power over them. Peace had not been found in running from the darkness. It had been built, slowly and deliberately, day by unnamed day, in the simple, courageous act of choosing to face the light, together. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from in the world. We'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To further support us and help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.